Howdy folks, welcome to the channel Trickle Down Philosophy. That's its name for now. That's what the impetus of the channel is anyway. Philosophy infiltrates everything, if you will. Every line of thought, it's a philosophical construct. I think everything is about belief. I don't think it's about what we know, because absolute certainty to me is unattainable. There's reliability. Drop a rock from your hand, it goes down. Based on my life experience, that's what happens. There is no basis for suggesting that it will always be that way, that the quote-unquote laws of physics or the way in which we've observed things so far in our neck of the woods, in our sliver of the universe's existence, that those physics won't change. In fact, it's posited that in the singularity that is theorized by some to have given rise to all the matter in the universe, it's an infinitely dense point in which the physics of the universe were so radically different than what they are now. So it's even acknowledged by some very bright people that laws, so to speak, can change. Things do change. Right now, we have to account for the fact that galaxies appear to be moving away from us faster than the speed of light. That creates a problem for relativity, special relativity, and all that. But anyway, let's see this one. 13 more Bible contradictions. And we do like consistency, we human beings, because we are wired for pattern recognition, and anything that doesn't fit in our pattern is a problem. The reason contradictions in the Bible are such a big deal for some folks, and legitimately so, is that the idea is that God is the author of the Bible. He dictated to people what to write. So the notion that there's one author of these writings, and this is certainly a prevalent idea in fundamentalist Christian circles, even though there are multiple authors, so to speak, these people just took dictation dutifully from God in the various decades in which they lived and or wrote, and therefore the Bible is perfect. There are no real contradictions, only apparent contradictions that need to be resolved. Because we as humans, we do not like contradictions because it does not fit into a neat pattern. So the notion of there being contradictions in the Bible create a problem for a theologian who says this was all authored by one being, a perfect being, and therefore the words on these pages are perfect. There are no contradictions. So if we observe one or two or 100, that produces a cognitive dissonance that needs to be accounted for. Now the atheist says, I account for it by saying the so-called evidence for a God that you think exists in the Bible is null and void by all these contradictions. And the ardent religionist will say, no, the problem is with you. You need to change what you believe. These words are fine. We will find the answer. We'll find a way to patchwork these contradictions together. Let's see where we go.
In my last video on biblical contradictions, we looked at 12 different contradictions in the Bible, and today we'll be exploring 13 more. As in my last video, I'll be doing my best to avoid vague or contextual commands, metaphorical statements, and details that can easily and reasonably be reconciled. Like, who spiced up Jesus' body? According to John, a rich guy named Nicodemus buried Jesus in 75 pounds of spices the night of his death. But Mark has 3 chicks, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, showing up the next day to spice up the body. Just how much myrrh does one dead guy need?
Thanks a lot for the gold and frankincense.
Monty
But don't worry too much about the myrrh next time, alright?
But see, I don't necessarily see this as contradictory, especially if the women didn't know that Jesus had already been spiced up. Oh wait, when you include a third gospel, Luke 23 says that these women saw where and how Jesus was buried. So I guess this one's technically not impossible, it's just really odd and unlikely. But here's a bigger biblical whoopsie. In both 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, King David, the same David of David and Goliath fame, has his commander Joab take a census of Israel's fighting men, which enrages God. Why God hates censuses so much is a little unclear, but then again, this is the same God who hates gay people and fig trees, so I'm not going to split hairs. Because of the census, God gives David several punishments to choose from. 3 years of famine, 3 months fleeing from his enemies, or 3 days of plague.
Bring out your dead!
In both accounts, David chooses plague and 70,000 people die before David builds an altar on the threshing floor of Arona the Jebusite, sacrifices some oxen, and God lifts the curse. In 1 Chronicles, Satan is the one who incited David to take the census, but in 2 Samuel, instead of Satan, it's God who incited David to take the census. Yikes.
Yeah, and I've heard that when I used to run a fundamentalist Christian circle for a couple of years. This is going back several decades now, and I'm agnostic, just so that you know. I don't care if people believe or if they don't believe. I like nice people. I like thoughtful people, people who you can engage in discussion with. The gentleman who put this video together actually is taking a measured approach to what he believes. He's not being an overly pedantic douche. And those exist on both sides. In any group, whether it's political, religious, any group, anywhere, you're going to find your folks who are very ardently in favor of their own ability to think and the conclusions that they've reached. This guy seems to be pretty measured. But in fundamentalist Christian circles, they would say, well, this is a figure of speech of permission. God gave permission to Satan to do these things. So God didn't himself do it. He wouldn't himself have done it, but he allowed it to happen. And you could decide if that's acceptable or not. To me, an all-powerful, all-loving being would not allow somebody to do something this harmful to people any more than a mother would allow somebody to do something harmful to their own child. Oh, I'm going to allow you to kick my son in the teeth. A mother's not going to do that. So an all-loving, all-powerful God, why would he allow that to happen? That doesn't make sense to me.
Bible can't tell God's actions apart from the devil's. Now, the Jewish people saw King David as the greatest king in Israel's history, and after centuries of subjugation to one empire after another, they dreamed of a great king anointed by God who would drive out their oppressors and establish a unified kingdom of Israel. They yearned for it and prophesied about this coming Messiah, or anointed one. So when the Gospels of Matthew and Luke were written, both authors attempted to tie Jesus' lineage back to King David to show that he was of royal descent. Matthew 1 and Luke chapter 3 both give Jesus' family tree. There are just a couple problems. The genealogies are radically different. To rectify this, Christians often claim that one is for Jesus' mom Mary and the other is for his dad Joseph, but this doesn't work at all because both overtly say that they're tracing the line of Joseph. In Matthew's account, Joseph's biological father is listed as Jacob. In Luke's account, it's Heli. You can't have two different biological dads. Matthew's genealogy has 25 generations between Joseph and King David. Luke's account has 40. And it's weird because a couple of the names in the middle are the same in both genealogies.
All right, and here this goes back to what I said earlier. If mankind is giving their account of these things, it makes sense that there would be differences. If God is the author of this, it does not make sense. So the idea that there are contradictions or inconsistencies would impugn the idea that God wrote this, that God had people write this, because if there's one author who's presumably in control of his own faculties and is having people write these things, there wouldn't be contradictions, unless he's got an incredible sense of humor and just wants to see the Petri dish in which we live on planet Earth play out in some screwed up ways. Then it does suggest that, well, maybe God didn't have these people write it. That, to me, is the most commonsensical approach. That happens to be my belief, that people wrote their accounts of what they thought was happening. It doesn't automatically mean what was happening was wrong or their accounts were wrong. It just means the very premise that God wrote this stuff does not hold water, so to speak.
And the Matthew account literally contradicts itself by claiming that there were 42 generations from Abraham to Jesus, specifically 14 from Abraham to David, 14 more from David to the Babylonian exile, and another 14 to Jesus. But the names it lists only add up to 41. This is basic arithmetic. The Bible literally fails at counting. And if you compare Matthew's genealogy to the Old Testament genealogies, they majorly contradict each other. 1 Chronicles 3 and Matthew 1 both follow the line of David through Solomon. They both start off identical, with Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joram, and then Matthew completely skips over 3 people. They meet back up with Uzziah, who was also called Azariah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Amon, and Josiah, but then Matthew leaves out another name, Jehoiakim. You know, the father of the guy who became king at both 8 and 18, who I mentioned in my last video.
So now I will say here too that one way of escaping the contradictions here would be to say, well, a scribe screwed up, because scribes did insert their theologies into the text, or they impacted the texts, because by and large, the world was illiterate at that time. And so if you were a scribe, and they're mentioned fairly commonly throughout, certainly in parts of the New Testament, that they were the ones doing the rewriting of the letters or the duplicating of the letters, and sometimes decades later, and they would insert their own ideas into it or do their best translation if they could, or just copying it. They would have certain marks that were left in or left out, and that would give sometimes the opposite sense of what was being said. But that is one way of sort of getting out of the charge of this being a contradiction and it only being an apparent one. I'm not saying this is my view. I'm simply saying that it's a matter of argumentation or discussion and preserving one's own belief in the cognitive dissonance that may be taking place here. This is one way of escaping it and keeping yourself comfortable within the idea that God wrote all this stuff. It's just people screwed it up.
Basically, the author of Matthew trimmed out 4 generations to try to get this down to a beautifully symbolic 42 generations from Abraham to Jesus, but he trimmed out 1 too many and accidentally ended up with 41. Both accounts then mention Jeconiah, Shealtiel, and Zerubbabel, but Matthew says Shealtiel was Zerubbabel's dad, while 1 Chronicles says that he's his uncle, which I suppose there could have been 2 cousins named Zerubbabel, so I won't count that as a contradiction. At that point, the genealogies diverge. Now, as much as I am sure that you love studying lists of names of a bunch of old dead dudes, I swear this is the last thing that I'll say about the genealogies in this video, and it has to do with the weirdest part about them. Both passages, Matthew and Luke, are very clear that Jesus is a direct descendant of King David in order to fulfill the messianic prophecy that the chosen Messiah would be of King David's lineage. Jeremiah 33:15 through 17, Isaiah 9:7, and multiple other New Testament passages make this very clear. The Messiah was meant to be a branch of King David's tree, a direct descendant, the seed of King David, according to the flesh, the fruit of his loins. But at the same time, Matthew and Luke both claim that Mary was not impregnated by Joseph, but by the Holy Spirit of God, which would mean that Jesus was not the fruit of King David's loins. Just
bingo. That's, as they say, the elephant in the room, which is a cliche that just draws your attention to the fact that there's a big problem here staring us in the face. If God impregnated Mary, the genealogy is out the window. Now, one way of patching it up would be to say, well, he just used the same seed that David would have used, but so Mary would be a virgin giving birth. Yeah, he had to do it this way. Then, according to Judaic law, if you impregnate somebody that is not your wife, that I don't know if that would be considered rape, but it would be considered some form of adultery. And we say, well, God could do whatever he wants. It's not an actual man on top of Mary and banging away at her, so to speak. It's just going to magically put the seed inside her, and she's going to give birth to a sinless man. But Mary wasn't sinless. So how did the DNA that was implanted in Mary, even if we go along with this part, she wasn't sinless. She may have been a very, very good woman, but she wasn't sinless. So was her DNA completely ineffective? If it was, then the baby would have been stillborn. So then you get into the issue based on what we know about DNA and zygotes and how the egg is fertilized and so forth. Even if you have a perfect fertilization from God into the egg, her DNA is still marrying to it. So then that blood would not be pure or perfect. And you do wind up with another problem there that you could just say, well, I don't know. I don't get it. I believe it, but I don't get it. And that's a fair assessment of faith, of one's own, what one believes, right? Say, I don't understand it all, but I believe it. But to come out and say, I know this is true because it says it here, it's like, well, it kind of stands against certain things that we've come to understand about how DNA works and the role of the egg that actually is in the mother, part of her own biology. That biology, according to the text, became Jesus, became this man. So his blood wouldn't have been perfect, so the sacrifice wouldn't have been perfect. So you run into these sorts of theological difficulties. All right, I'm going to end it there. We're 6 minutes in here, and I'll end it there. So yeah, I mean, the notion of contradictions none of us likes contradictions. I mean, a lie is a contradiction. So we like consistency. That's what we like. And there are inconsistencies here that need to be reconciled. And it ultimately points back to the notion that God didn't write this. That is the goal, so to speak. That is where you would go back to, that this doesn't have one author. And that therefore the Bible is not dispositive on historical or other types of matters. It becomes more a matter of people giving their ideas on the way things work or worked, and then you could read that the same way you'd read Shakespeare or the Bhagavad Gita or any other text. You could choose to believe parts of it or none of it or some of it. So, all right, folks, leave your thoughts, subscribe. Thanks for getting this far into the video. I'll see you on another video, and keep thinking philosophically. Hey, folks. If you want to take the personality test that I created for my life coaching practice, which is based on the book that I wrote, put your phone up, turn it on camera, and focus on this, and it'll take you to it. And it'll take you about 20 minutes to complete the test. It's free, and you'll get some information on your personality. It's quite detailed, quite revealing. It's kind of fun as well. And I'll be leaving this QR code up on the wall behind me for my regular videos. So I hope you take it, and I hope you enjoy it.